Hello, one and all, and welcome to KBC's Bible Study. And we're looking through Genesis chapter 38, verses 1 to 30 today. And it's the character of Tamar. We're looking through men and women of the Bible. Tamar is the study today. Three women in the scripture named Tamar. This is the daughter-in-law of Judah, found in Genesis 38. I think Hugh's going to tackle the daughter of King David later on in September. But this is Tamar, the daughter-in-law of Judah. And you remember who Judah is? He's one of the sons of Jacob, one of the many sons. One of the sons of Jacob were Joseph, of course. But here's Judah, and he's got three sons. Three sons. His first son is called That's not a pause. That's his name, E-R. His second son is called Onan, or Onan. And his third son is called Shelah. I'll call it Shelah rather than Sheila, just because I want to. So there we go. Now, this is a tricky scripture. It's what Nick Page calls a strange tale, and what Ross Clark calls not exactly family friendly. It's not Little House on the Prairie or the Waltons. We're into some tricky subject matter here. And whenever I come across a scripture that has some questions that are thrown up as a result of the study, I either go into one of two modes. I either say, right, okay, that's too much for me. I'll park that and I'll ask God about it at a later date. It might even be so late I'm in heaven. But the other mode I go into is, no, I'm going to really knuckle down, dig down and find out what I can get from this scripture. I might read some, commentaries and pray about it and see what I can really dig out. So I've done a little bit of that. There will still be some questions remaining, but we'll see what we can unpack from the scripture. So we've already said that Judah was the son of Jacob, and Judah had three sons, Onan, and Shelah. And in that culture, it fell to Judah to find a wife for his eldest initially. So he chooses Tamar. Well, I say he chooses. He thinks he's chosen her, but actually, I think it's God who's chosen her. And we need to understand that in this story, that God has planned this in some way. He's chosen Tamar to be part of the genealogy of Jesus. If you read Matthew chapter 1, you'll see Tamar's name is there. Now, none of those names appear by accident. So God has his hand of blessing upon Tamar. And that's no mistake. And if you see this chapter through that lens, it changes things. It helps you to understand what's going on. So before they have any children, dies. Dies, so they don't have any children. Well, I say dies, actually it's God who takes him out. He's so wicked, that's the reason. And you have to be particularly bad for God to intervene in that way. Rarely does God act like that in scripture. His default mode, God's mode, is one of patience, amazing patience. In the face, his holiness in the face of a wicked world, God has to be patient. But here also, bear in mind, he's protecting Tamar. And if really was that wicked, then Tamar was in danger, and he's protecting Tamar. He's got his hand of blessing on her, making sure she's okay. So according to the customs of the day, it falls to the husband's nearest relative, usually the brother, to look after the wife if he dies. So Onan married Tamar. And that practice is described in Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 and 6, by the way. So that would offer the woman some protection and provide her with offspring to continue the line. But crucially, the child would be regarded as belonging to the elder brother, not him. Now, Onan knows this, so he agrees to marry her, but he makes sure they don't have any children. Read how that's achieved, or how he tries to achieve that, in verse 9 of the chapter. I won't read it to you. The real wickedness here is the motive to deprive Tamar of children to suit his own needs or his own requirements, which not only meant great shame for her, but also it was acting in direct opposition to God's purposes, remember. God had chosen Tamar to be part of the genealogy of Jesus. And he stands in the way. So what does God do? He takes him out. He takes him out. And I think that's the reason. It's not because necessarily, I think anyway, of the method he chose to deprive her of children. So again, God steps in. By this time, Judah, the father, is thinking, golly, I've lost two sons. I don't want to lose another. But instead of making sure that Shelah, or Shelah, who would be the natural successor, his behavior is better than the previous two, he decides to trick Tamar. How does he do that? Well, even though the final son Shelah is in line to marry her, he's rather young. So he says to Tamar, go home to your family, wait for Shelah to get older because he's a bit young, and you can come back when he's older and marry him. But he never intends to fulfill that promise. And in doing so, that would mean Tamar would remain unmarried and a widow and childless. So Judah's got to be careful here. He's now acting in direct opposition to God's purposes. And you know what happened to the last two who tried that. Nevertheless, Tamar returns home in good faith and waits for a long time. So long, in fact, that Judah's wife has died in the meantime. But Tamar eventually gets wise to what's happening. In verse 14 we read, for she saw that though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. Now Ross Clark writes this, Tamar knows her rights. Tamar knows her place. Tamar is going to fight for her place in the family. She's not going to be passive about this. Tamar is bold and she's brave. She isn't afraid to act shamelessly in order to shame her father-in-law for what he's done. So she takes drastic action. She disguises herself as a shrine prostitute, not advised, without even knowing who she was when Judah walks past, rather, I suppose, predictably, because we know something about his character, he takes advantage of her. So she's just positioned herself in the line of fire, as it were, and Judah, when he's going to the temple, he takes advantage of her. Now he sleeps with her and she becomes pregnant with his child. Judah doesn't even know that it is Tamar because she has her face covered. Now, we have to be careful here because obviously Tamar's example is not one to be followed, obviously. She's put herself potentially in harm's way and she's acting in a way that's not godly. But Ross Clark, the writer of the devotional, says that, I suppose, implies that you have to admire her resilience and her fight, her spirit. She's fought for her rights, as it were, and taken from Judah what should have been hers anyway, a child. And amazingly, in the end, Tamar is not shamed for her actions. She isn't even blamed for her actions. Even Judah himself says this, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah. And that's in verse 26 of the chapter. So what's the result of all this? Well, Tamar is the first of just 3 women to be named in the genealogy of Christ in Matthew chapter 1, verse 3. And she wouldn't allow any man to take that right away from her, that right to be counted in the family of God's people. That's what Ross Clark brings from this story. But stories like these leave us with tricky questions, don't they? We might look at that and say, well, why didn't God provide a more perfect way to continue the line that would eventually result in his son? Why are these imperfect situations and people granted the privilege of being included in the messianic line? Well, one solution offered that I read simply shows us that God's purpose is accomplished despite man's mistakes and imperfections. I think that's a valid point, like the story of Samson or Jonah or others like them. Sometimes their actions, like ours, are much less than perfect, but God's purposes are accomplished anyway, aren't they? I mean, it's better to act honourably and in a godly way, like Joseph and others like him, that despite what was happening around him, God's purposes were achieved. But it is a comfort to know that our negative actions cannot thwart God's plans. Our mistakes cannot interrupt God's purposes. He will be sovereign and achieve his purposes in any case, no matter what happens. The Bible teaches that. So the question remaining really is this, and it really boils down to this simple question. Do you want God to achieve his purposes despite your actions, or because of your involvement and because of your cooperation and be included in that wonderful plan? Well, I choose the latter. What about you? Thanks for listening. God bless. Take care. Bye for now.